The beginning of witch hunts. The origin and background of witch hunts. Witch hunts have a long history, dating back to medieval Europe. During this time, many people believed in and feared the existence of witches. Religious beliefs and social anxiety were a major factor in the witch hunts. In Europe at that time, heretics and paganism were seen as a threat, and the church justified witch hunts to counter them. For example, from the 13th to the 15th centuries, the church severely cracked down on heretics and those suspected of witches. This marked the beginning of the large-scale witch hunts that later spread throughout Europe. In this way, witch hunts were born out of a combination of religious background and social anxiety. The definition of witches and the subject of suspicion. In medieval Europe, those who were considered witches were believed to have certain behaviors and characteristics. Witches were considered to have made a pact with the devil, and to harm people using magic. Women, especially unmarried and elderly women, were often suspected of being witches. For example, when misfortunes such as injuries, illnesses, and crop failures occurred, they were blamed on witches and those suspected were put on trial. Just being suspected could lead to being ostracized from society and punished. Those suspected of being witches were used as scapegoats for social unrest, and became the targets of witch hunts. Religious factors and social unrest. Religious factors and social unrest contributed greatly to the expansion of witch hunts. In medieval Europe, Christianity had a strong influence, and heretics and pagans were considered to be people who should be eliminated. In addition, social unrest and economic difficulties drove people to witch hunts. For example, when disasters such as plagues and famines struck, people blamed witches and the devil for them, and the church used this to strengthen its authority. This led to the widespread development of witch hunts. Religious factors and social anxiety were intertwined, and the rapid spread of witch hunts was due to these complex factors. The reality of witch hunts, witch trial methods and torture. Witch trials were harsh, with horrific torture. Many people were found guilty and lost their lives despite being innocent. Those who were suspected of being witches were forced to confess through torture. Brutal torture was used, and incredible violence was justified in order to obtain a confession. For example, tortures such as waterboarding and fireboarding were used, and many people could not bear this and made false confessions. In addition, after obtaining a confession, they were often publicly executed and punished as witches. Witch trials were supported by fear and violence, and many innocent people became victims. Chain of accusations and mass hysteria. Witch hunts spread due to mass hysteria, and accusations continued in a chain reaction. Once someone was accused of being a witch, the people around her began to be suspected one after another. This caused fear in the entire community and mass hysteria. For example, in the Salem witch trials, many people were accused of being witches after the testimony of young girls. Suspicion spread, and innocent people were punished, one after another as witches. Chain of accusations and mass hysteria were factors that made witch hunts more intense and widespread. Actual victims. The actual victims of witch hunts were innocent, but they fell victim to social prejudice and fear. Many of the victims were people who were in a socially vulnerable position. In particular, women, the poor, and those who were isolated from society were suspected of being witches and put on trial. For example, in Salem, many poor, widows and elderly women who were isolated from the community were accused of witchcraft. They had no way to resist, and were found guilty and lost their lives. The victims of witch hunts were victims of social anxiety and prejudice, and their suffering is recorded in history. The spread and impact of witch hunts. Areas where witch hunts spread. Witch hunts spread throughout medieval Europe, and were particularly intense in certain areas. Witch hunts were particularly intense in Germany, France, Switzerland, and parts of England. In these areas, religious conflicts and social unrest were strong, and witch hunts spread rapidly. For example, in Würzburg, Germany, about 900 people were executed as witches between 1626 and 1631. A large-scale witch hunt also took place in Rouen, France, and many people lost their lives. Witch hunts intensified in certain areas, and had a serious impact on the society of those areas. Political intentions and the use of witch hunts. Witch hunts were sometimes used for political purposes. Those in power used witch hunts to strengthen their authority and eliminate opponents. Witch hunts were not simply the product of religious fanaticism, but were sometimes used as a political tool. those in power used witch hunts to eliminate their enemies and solidify their power base. For example, King James I of England supported witch hunts, which resulted in the execution of many people. He used witch hunts to emphasize his religious authority and suppress political opposition. Witch hunts were sometimes used for political purposes, and their impact was not limited to simply religious issues. The impact of witch hunts on society. Witch hunts had a serious impact on European society as a whole. Fear and suspicion spread throughout society, and many innocent people became victims. The impact of witch hunts was widespread and weakened social cohesion. In addition, the lack of religious tolerance and the abuse of power further fueled social anxiety. For example, in areas where witch hunts were carried out, trust between residents collapsed, and it became common for neighbors to become suspicious of each other. This led to the collapse of local communities and the isolation of people. The impact of witch hunts on society was serious, and it cast a long shadow over subsequent history. The end of witch hunts and lessons learned. Reasons for the decline and end of witch hunts. Witch hunts gradually declined from the end of the 17th century to the beginning of the 18th century, and eventually came to an end. The reason witch hunts declined is due to the spread of the Enlightenment, and the dispelling of superstitions through the development of scientific knowledge. Reason and science came to be valued, and witch hunts were gradually considered outdated. For example, in England, the last witch trial took place in 1717, and witch hunts effectively ended after that. In France and Germany, witch hunts also gradually died down, due to the spread of reason and science. Thus, witch hunts came to an end with the spread of the Enlightenment, and remained as a part of history. Lessons from witch hunts and society afterwards. Witch hunts left many lessons for modern society. History teaches us how ignorance and fear can create tragedies. The history of witch hunts shows how easily prejudice and fear can drive people crazy and victimize the innocent. This led to a gradual recognition of the importance of religious tolerance and human rights. For example, after the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man was adopted, emphasizing the rights of the individual. In addition, religious tolerance spread, and persecution of heretics and non-believers decreased. The lessons of witch hunts are still very important today, and serve as a guide to ensure that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. The influence of witch hunts in modern society. The influence of witch hunts casts a shadow over the structure of prejudice and discrimination that can be seen in modern society. As witch hunts show, the impact of fear and prejudice on group psychology continues to this day, and is expressed in various forms of discrimination and persecution in modern society. For example, situations in which certain groups or individuals are alienated from society and subjected to discrimination and persecution can still be seen today. These arise from ignorance and fear, just like witch hunts. Even in modern society, we are required to remember the lessons of witch hunts and overcome prejudice and discrimination. Well, this time we have delved deep into the horrific history of witch hunts in medieval Europe. Witch hunts are a symbol of tragedy brought about by ignorance and fear, and their effects still remain in our society today. By learning history, we can learn from past mistakes and build a better future. With the lessons of witch hunts in mind, we want to prevent similar tragedies from being repeated in modern society. Next time, let's explore the mysteries and stories buried in history together. New discoveries and surprises await you, so please look forward to it. If you found this video interesting, please like or subscribe. See you in the next video. Thank you.